Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by an old friend, Mike Luttig, with whom I worked a bit in the George H.W. Bush administration when he had very senior position, very important position at the Justice Department as head of the Office of Legal Counsel. Was appointed as a federal judge in 1991 to the Fourth Circuit. Was one of the most distinguished circuit judges for 15 years after that. Famously, I think you sent more Supreme Court clerks to the Supreme Court than any other appellate judge, perhaps, and very highly respected in conservative, not just in conservative legal circles, but in all legal circles. I was reviewing your biography last night, and like your mentor and hero, I guess, Justice Scalia, you dissented from conservative orthodoxy on a couple of occasions. And see that one terrorism case I remember where you dissented, saying that as an American citizen, someone I think we captured in Afghanistan had certain legal rights, and you were in the minority on the circuit, I think, but the Supreme Court upheld your view in 2004. Judge Luttig left the court in 2006, was a corporate counsel for over a decade. Very interesting career, executive branch, judicial branch, private sector. We'll have to have a separate discussion about what you learned about America from all these different aspects of your career. But today, I want to talk about 2020 and the current crisis, the crisis of 2020 and the crisis of today in terms of our democracy and our presidential elections. So, Mike Luttig, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Bill. I don't think I've ever uttered these words to anyone, but it's a pleasure to be on your show this morning.
These judges are kind of averse to mere discussions with the hoi polloi, but that's okay. It's nice of you to bend once for us. So you were there as someone who knows the government so well and follows his thoughts so much about the rule of law and the Constitution and served elections every 4 years. I mean, what were you thinking, I guess? I mean, you played a role, which we'll come to in a second, in 2020, a very important one. But as you watched it unfold, both before the election day and then between November 3rd and January 4th, which I guess is when you get directly involved or you're brought in directly, it's not your choice. What were you thinking and how alarmed were you? Did you think this was just a little bit of noise and kind of silliness, or were you seriously alarmed about the election and democracy?
Bill, I had been watching the lead up to January 6th for several months, even before the election. In particular, I was focused on the former president's statements that he was going to win the election, and if he didn't, he was going to contest the election post-November. And in particular, I remember, it was about that time that thoughtful people began asking whether President Trump would leave the White House, even if he were to lose. My wife and I, she's about the only one I talk to about anything sensitive, and she first raised it with me and said, I don't think that Trump's going to leave the White House. And, I dismissed that. I said, well, look, first off, that's just not a possibility. It's not an option. And of course, it would be unprecedented in all of history. She continued to say, as the weeks and months progressed, that no, she was utterly convinced that he would never leave. And there finally came a day before the election, although only days before the election, where she, how wives are. She said, "Look, I told you so, and you didn't listen to me, and he's not going to leave." And that was the first time where I said to her, "Look, I'm not sure that he's going to leave, even if he loses." But I had been watching the lead up to the election and of course the post-election activities very closely. I was, I don't do politics, never have, but I was very interested in the constitutional and legal questions that were going to be presented to the nation.
Yeah, no, and you ended up opining on them in a very important way. But I'm just curious in that between November 3rd and January 6th, you were and are a friend of Bill Barr, the Attorney General. I think you've been in touch with him at times during his tenure. Many mutual friends as well. Anything particular alarm you in that period that maybe other people didn't notice as much? I'm thinking, of course, of his leaving, his rather sudden resignation or firing, depending on how you think about it, in December of 2020, something pretty unprecedented. I mean, to sort of at first the Secretary of Defense is fired a week after the election, then the Attorney General of the United States resigns because presumably there were things Trump was asking that he felt he couldn't do, or just a month before the inauguration. Did that particularly alarm you, or was it just everything, the state legislators, the speeches, the whole behavior of the former president?
Well, Bill and I are very close friends. I don't remember talking in that time period, though we could have, and we certainly could have emailed with each other. But to your question, Bill, I understood in a way that probably others could not, by virtue of our friendship, the monumental significance of Bill, the Attorney General, Bill Barr, stating publicly that there was the department had quote investigated and concluded that there was insufficient evidence of fraud to turn the election around. And of course, that was the trigger for the showdown between the Attorney General and former President Trump that we now know through Bill's book, occurred in the Oval Office.
Yeah, and I think that was key. It's good to be reminded of that, because that's what really made the former president go to outside legal counsels and start, embracing various theories of what state legislatures could do and how they could sort of override the actual vote counts in their states, which, if he had had a compliant Justice Department, of course, could have looked quite different, don't you think?
Yeah. There's no question. But to elaborate just a moment more, I knew when Bill Barr came forward and said that there was insufficient fraud, I knew personally and deeply that was the most significant moment, to date. I knew good and well how the former president would respond to that very public statement.
So then on December 14th, whenever the electors are selected in the different states, and there's a lot of hubbub still, and Trump, the former president, is trying to call people and pressure people to overturn it, and there are legal arguments floating around about that. And you're following, and then the role of the vice president becomes a question because of January 6th, and what would Congress do, and what could he do? And you're following all this, and then why don't you just tell us how you become a player in it, not simply a very intelligent and attentive follower of it?
Yes. As now has been reported, widely, I was, my wife and I were out in Colorado at the time. And I think it was for us in the evening of January 4th, we were having dinner and I got a call from, my good friend, and incidentally, Bill Barr's good friend, Richard Cullen, who is now with Governor Youngkin in Virginia. Richard and I had been talking, frankly, for 2 years straight about all things political, because he was, for those 2 years, representing Vice President Pence, primarily in connection with the Robert Mueller investigation. And then, of course, our mutual friend was Attorney General. So, I mean, we talked multiple times every day for, months and months. And I say that for that background for this reason. When Richard called me that night, it was just like old friends talking, as if you and I were talking. But he said on that night, he said, he calls me Judge, which is fine. And he said, Judge, do you know John Eastman? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, I said, John was one of my clerks, maybe 25 years ago or so. And after clerking with me, he went on to clerk at the Supreme Court with Justice Thomas. And he said, I said, well, why are you asking? And he said, so you don't really know why I'm calling? And I said, no, I don't. He said, well, John Eastman, Professor Eastman, is advising President Trump and Vice President Pence, that Vice President Pence has the power under the Constitution to reject electoral slates from various states, and in effect, Richard said, unilaterally decide the presidency. And I said, because I had been following it, and this is my whole life, the legal parts of this. I knew and understood instantly the gravity of and significance of the moment. So I said, well, look, Richard, you can tell the vice president, if you want, that I said that he has no such authority under the Constitution and laws of the United States, and that his only choice at this point is to accept and for Congress to count the electoral college votes as they have been cast. And Richard said, he knows that. I've told him that. And I said, okay, fine. And I said, look, really casually, Bill, I said, look, I'll be glad to help in any way I can, and we hung up. So, my wife, who had been hearing one side of that conversation, said, what on earth was that? And so I explained to her, and she, said something like, oh my God, and I said, yeah, I mean, look, it's a big deal, but I'm not involved in this at all, so that was it, and so the next morning, I get up around 4:30 in the mornings, early bird, and so I was having my coffee, as I remember, somewhere around 5:30 in Colorado time, 7:30 on the East Coast, and Richard calls, and again it was a fairly casual conversation at its inception, because Richard and I often talk in the early morning hours, so I didn't think much of it. But he said, the first words out of his mouth were something to the effect that we have to help the vice president. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, I don't really know what I mean. And I said, even though I'm a ham, I was not a ham on that call. And I said, but I did say, well, what do you mean? What, you don't know what you mean? If you don't know what you mean, how do I know what you mean? And he said, look, this is deadly serious. You know, the vice president needs your help because he's, I believe he said the vice president was going to meet with President Trump in the Oval Office for lunch later that day. And so, you know, then began something of a surreal hour, frankly, for me. You know, because I told Richard, you know, I said, well, Richard, I literally said, look, I'm a nobody. I said, you know, what's worse than that? I don't even have a job. I had retired from Boeing and was going to take a job with the Coca-Cola company literally on the morning of January 6th. But I said to Richard, look, I have no job. I don't even, I'm out in Colorado. I don't have a printer. What can I possibly do? And he says, well, I don't know. I said, well, what does the vice president want me to do? And he says, well, he doesn't know either. And I said, well, so what's going on? And he said, look, you know, we just need to get your voice out to the country. Well, at that, I was like flummoxed. I'm going, well, the one thing that I know I'm incapable of doing is getting my voice out to the country in the next hour. And he said, look, this is serious. I said, I get it. He said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. So I said, fine, and, you know, hung up and continued, you know, my coffee, thinking about what I could possibly do. He calls back in 5 minutes. He says, if you figured out anything? I said, no, Richard, frankly, I don't even have a thought. And he said, I'll call you back in 10 minutes, but we don't have much time. So he calls back in 10 minutes and he says, you know, what can you do? And I said, Richard, honest to God, I'm racking my brain, but I don't have a thought at all. I mean, just think what you're asking me to do. I said, I don't even know where to start. And he said, look, I'll call back in 5 minutes. And I said, okay. So he called back in 5 minutes and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, look, I had one thought. I guess I could tweet something. But between you and me, I said, I don't know how to tweet at all. And I certainly don't know how to tweet anything more than whatever the number of characters is that you're allowed to tweet, which I didn't even know at the time. And he said, this is absolutely perfect. You have to do this. And I said, I told you I don't know how to. And he said, get it done. So I sat there on my iPhone, and it's still very early in Colorado. And I typed out on my iPhone what all of you now know is the tweet. And then I called Richard back and I said, okay, look, I got something here. I said, but look, I will never utter a single word that the vice president himself doesn't personally approve. I said, that's just me. I'm traditional, conventional, and I'm just not going to do it. And he said, the vice president will be fine with anything you say. And I said, well, I don't really care if he's fine with that. I'm not fine with it. And he must approve it or I will not tweet it. And Richard said, I'll call you right back. So he calls me right back and he says, the vice president will be perfectly fine with anything that you say. And I said, I'm still not going to do it, Richard. And he said, you must do it now. And I said, okay, but I don't like this. So I go down to my office down a floor in Colorado, and I began this tortured process of trying to get this tweet done, with the clock ticking and Richard breathing down my neck. And I don't think we want to know, your viewers and listeners care much about the details of that. It's hilarious, but the basic idea was I took the text that I had written on my iPhone in an email and blocked and copied it and pasted it into a Word document. And then I divided the Word document into 180 characters or fewer tweets. Right. And then I went on Twitter and not knowing how to do this, but my son, told me and to send I guess it's called a thread, and then I typed each individual piece of that thread in, proofed it, multiple times. Frankly, I didn't want to do it. I was nervous. I was even scared. But finally, hit the tweet button, not knowing and not having any idea even what I was doing, who, if anyone, would ever see those words. And as far as I knew and believed, that was the last that I would ever hear of the tweet. Okay.
I mean, I'm struck. I guess you ended up speaking to the vice president. I think you said the day after January 7th, but I mean, he clearly wanted reputable and more than reputable conservative legal authorities to be justifying what he was already planning to do. Is that your sense? It's not that he was wavering. It's that he wanted help in bolstering himself and his case against the pressure he was getting. I don't want to put words in your mouth or his mouth, but that sounds like that.
And of course, I will not put words in his mouth, but I will just say, what we know is that, well, first off, to answer your question, I was working with his staff, in particular Mark Short, through Richard Cullen, and never the vice president personally until after January 6th. But there was no question in my mind but that the vice president had made his decision, and that and I didn't know or believe this at the time, but he was marshaling as much support nationally as he could for what he had decided he must do.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's great that you did that. My former boss, Dan Quayle, for whom I worked obviously in the George H.W. Bush administration, and with whom you worked as well, some on various issues when you were at the Justice Department. Then also, I think felt that he was called. I think he said this publicly that the vice president wanted to be reassured that he had to do what he was going to do, and it was the right thing to do. And then, of course, you get cited by the vice president in the letter he sends on January 6th.
Let me interject there because I don't know the vice president even to personally to this day, and I would never say that I'm friends with or know former Vice President Quayle, but the Vice President Pence and former Vice President Quayle apparently are close friends. So there's no question that we know there's no question that Vice President Pence sought the opinion of Vice President Quayle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's so striking that it got to that point, right? I mean, it's one thing to sort of pressure some it's not great, but to pressure some state legislators to float some legal doctrines of how they can discount certain votes or not count certain votes and all that. But that after December 14th, people both thought in terms of public pressure, but in terms of legal arguments as well, that it was reputable to have the vice president just overrule everything at this last ditch moment. Does that, I guess, did that surprise you then? Does that still surprise you, the degree to which the people were willing to go to even that extent? I kind of remember people heaving a bit of a sigh of relief after December 14th that, okay, we probably through the worst of it.
Yeah, of course, it only came to that point, not because of Vice President Pence, but because of former President Trump.
Right.
It's the real story in all of this is the excruciating, hydraulic, excruciating pressure that Trump put the Vice President Pence under. And Vice President Pence, even though he was only doing his constitutional duty, was a hero of that day, of course. But to your second question, I really didn't get grievously concerned until, after the January 6th, when I learned all that had been going.
Right.
We can talk about that as much or as little.
No, we should. I mean, I think that's a key point you make in the excellent piece you wrote for CNN, which people should take a look at from late April, which is, I mean, the degree to which this was a real plan, a real, it had its goofy elements, you might say, and its elements that were, kind of long shots and so forth. But this was not just let's assemble a crowd and be sort of responsible in egging them on, which I think the former president was. It's not just to have some, outside attorneys make some kind of wild charges. There was a pretty sustained effort for the whole period of time, to overturn the results of the election. I think that's something you've stressed subsequently. So talk a little bit about that. And then we can maybe talk about, of course, what that shows about the guardrails we do have and don't have, and that we ended up depending on Vice President Pence doing the right thing, against a lot of pressure is so striking.
Yeah, I with the rest of the country, I believed initially that all of this was just a bunch of kooks. Okay. Sidney Powell, people like that, and Giuliani. I was greatly concerned about it because, if you have that kind of persons around the President of the United States of America, and they are bent on overturning an election, it's a consequential thing. But, I guess probably my subconscious belief and hope was that, because this was the kind of people behind it, it was destined to fail of necessity. It wasn't until much later when I, at the same time that the rest of the country, began to understand that there were seriously intelligent people involved, in the effort, that I began to appreciate the real gravity of the situation.
No, that's such an important point, I think, and you make that in the CNN piece, that the kookiness tends to the clown show aspect of it tends to distract us from the gravity of what the effort was. And then to transition, I guess, of what our current situation is, was have we fixed things that, I mean, apart from having the character of the president matters a lot, of course, but have we fixed the guardrails that did hold, but without that much of a margin of error last time?
No, Bill, we haven't even begun. And my fear because the country is now, in my view, completely politicized and politically polarized, that there's a natural unwillingness for any of the players who can address the problems to address them in fact. That's a mouthful. You understand all of what I just said probably better than I do, as someone who's followed politics closer. But what we experienced on January 6th was a full-scale assault on our institutions of democracy and what I call the instrumentalities of our democracy. The former being literally, our tripartite system of government, and each part of that triumvirate of institutions. And by instrumentalities, I mean all of the, I think what you refer to as the guardrails is what I refer to as the instrumentalities.
Right.
Meaning the Constitution and laws that are constitute the bulwark of our democracy. And so because of this frightening politicization of everything and of American society, and the complete polarization of the politics, I believe that we're in greater danger, if you will, today than we were on January 6th. And by the way, the New York Times asked me on the anniversary of January 6th, this past January, to reflect on where I thought the country was a year later. And, I said for the New York Times something to the effect that I was grievously worried for the country on January 6th, 2021. And I'm even more concerned for the country on January 6th, 2022 than I was then. And by that, I meant what I just said to you. If the reaction of the nation had been to January 6th had been what it ought to have been, then I would not have any worries today and going forward about our country or our democracy. But of course, the reaction has been, the collective reaction, I'll say, has really been just the opposite of what it ought to have been. Namely, we have a complete denial of the 2020 election. We have a denial of the significance of January 6th for our country, and we have a continued war. Really, and I hate to say this, but we have a war going on now over America and over its institutions of democracy. I mean, that's I think a fair statement.
A discouraging one. I mean, let's leave aside for a second the, as it were, political side of it, which I, of course, totally agree with you on, how bad it is to have the denial of 2020. And as you've argued, I mean, that's really about 2024. It's not about 2020 anymore. And that's very worrisome and dangerous. But on the sort of more institutional side, the instrumentalities, you've urged that the Electoral Count Act be reformed and strengthened, and that there be bipartisan efforts to simply make it harder to pull off what people tried to pull off in 2020, clarify certain things, say a word about just what the 2 or 3 key things that should be fixed are, at least in well, I would say general terms or in specific terms, but in state legislators, the vice president's role, et cetera. And that seems like I sort of agree with you, though. Someone came down from Mars and said, we had this terrible thing in January, from November 3rd to January 6th, November 3rd, 2020 to January 6th, 2021. We really don't want to go through that again. Surely by the summer, what are we talking, by the end of April, I guess beginning of May, 2022, at least Congress will have gotten together to fix some of the problems. They can't fix everything, and it's always, that you can't plug every hole, so to speak, and you can't make legislation perfect against bad actors, as you know very well, having been a judge. But you can strengthen the system that obviously had real holes in it, and it's pretty astonishing that nothing has happened. I mean, it hasn't. You've written a bit on this, and others have weighed in, but there's been no hearings, no legislation really even introduced, I think, formally yet, or certainly nothing, no great momentum, not that much of a sense of urgency. But so that I find kind of astonishing, and say a word about that if you want, but also I really would be curious, what 2 or 3 things should we focus on that are fixable?
I understand your astonishment and the astonishment of millions and millions of Americans. But I'm not astonished at all. For this reason, the reasons that I just explained previously, the politicization, total politicization, but of the country, which began, of course, on Capitol Hill and then in the White House. But for a year now, I've been consulting with and advising a critical number of senators and House members on the Electoral Count Act and their amendments. I have begun every single conversation, I think, with my observation that, look, I don't really think that there will ever be a consensus to even to amend the act, for the simple reason that all of you here on Capitol Hill want the power to determine the presidency if the time comes that you want that power. And every single person has said to me, yes, that's correct, and that's our problem. And then I've said, okay, well then I'll talk to you as long as you want, and brainstorm and give you whatever you want, and then you go forth and see if you can get it done. Now that I've been doing that for a year, and frankly, I haven't gotten a hint that there's any momentum to amend the Electoral Count Act until the CNN piece ran, and then I got some feedback, to the effect that, wow, okay, so you laid this bare, and that may get things moving. But for purposes of our discussion today, do I have any hope that this will actually get done, let alone done properly? No, not really. But to the particulars.
Yeah. So if yes, let's have some ray of hope here. And so, what if McConnell and Schumer called you in and said, "Okay, look, we are going to make something happen here. What are the 2 or 3 things we must do?" Yeah.
And not those 2 in particular, but that's what I've been telling the people that I've been advising and consulting with. Look, first off, I think all of your viewers and listeners understand that this is the law pursuant to which we count the electoral votes that are transmitted to Congress for the election of the president and the vice president. And very interesting to know is, as background, is that the 12th Amendment, which is the constitutional provision that speaks to this process, says little or nothing about the process. So in the Electoral Count Act of 1887, Congress took a stab at filling out, if you will, the process that would have to take place. Now, in that process, I believe that the Congress arrogated to itself power under the Constitution to decide the presidency. The Constitution doesn't give to Congress. But for today, that's neither here nor there, and I haven't stood on that position in my advice and counsel on the Hill. As you know, Bill, my friend and I, David Rifkin, wrote a piece about almost exactly a year ago about saying that for the Wall Street Journal, saying that the act is unconstitutional for the reason that it gives too much more power to the Congress than it could have. But in any event, so as would be relevant today, under the current act, it takes only a single member of the House and a single senator to present an objection to a slate of electors. And if one from each house does that, then it triggers the balance of the Electoral Count Act, which is circuitous, labyrinthian, to the point of being, utterly indecipherable to any but a talismanic scholar. And that process, it's triggered for both the House and the Senate to decide the objections to that slate of state electors in a host of circumstances that all depend upon, in essence, whether the state electoral votes were quote regularly given, and the electors and therefore their votes were lawfully certified. Both terms that are undefined and inherently ambiguous, essentially giving the Congress unchecked power and authority to decide the presidency. And so the first thing that ought to be done is to change the number in the House and Senate who can object to a slate, and increase that number, substantially, from 1 and 1 to whatever is I've advised is politically palatable on the Hill. And then the second thing is that once the act is triggered by an objection being forwarded to the House and Senate by the presiding officer of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States, that there are, votes that have to be taken. And what right now under the act, the thresholds for sustaining an objection are far too low. And so to amend the act, they need to increase the number of votes in the House and Senate that are necessary to sustain an objection, and therefore not to count the electoral votes from the particular state as to which the objections have been made. So, for instance, I know that some of the drafts on the Hill have ratcheted up that latter number as high as 50%. So 50% in the House and 50% in the Senate would be required to sustain an objection and throw out an electoral slate by the state. So in a nutshell, those are the two most important changes that could be made and and frankly, they're necessary to be made in order to prevent another January 6th.
Is there a way to make it harder for state legislators to simply step in and, as an act of will, override their own previous laws and the judgment of the voters?
So this begins to get us into the weeds, but I'll try to keep us out of the weeds.
That's okay. Weeds are useful if they're important weeds to help preserve our rule of law, you know.
We don't want to chase away your viewers, though.
That's true.
So this all begins, really for me, and I think for our purposes today, with the Constitution and the what's known as the Electors Clause of the Constitution. That clause of the Constitution purports to give what's known as plenary authority to the state legislatures over all things state electoral votes. And there's been a debate that will soon be resolved by the Supreme Court of the United States as to whether that legislative power that's granted in the Constitution is subject to in the first instance to state judicial review by the individual state Supreme Courts. The conservative view, if you will, just as a proxy for conversation, is that the legislatures have not only plenary but exclusive authority, so that there can be no review by either the state courts or, frankly, the federal courts, up to and including the Supreme Court, except as decisions by the state legislatures might implicate federal constitutional law. So that's where the 2020 election challenge began, as I said in the CNN piece. The former president's lawyers and legal team, they knew all about this, what's called the independent state legislature doctrine. They knew that it had never been embraced by the Supreme Court, and at least never embraced by the current Supreme Court. And they believed that there were 5 votes on the court to embrace the independent state legislature doctrine, and therefore deny all review of any decision made by the legislatures of the states. So knowing that, they initially, tried to legitimately, through the legislatures, change the electoral slates that had been voted and cast for President Biden, who had won the popular vote, won the presidency through the Electoral College vote, and also the popular vote. But they were not able to get what they would have considered legitimate alternative electoral slates certified by the state legislatures. And then unable to do that, they eventually were attempting to, as I said in the CNN piece, scare up illegitimate electoral slates. hearing myself nearing, if not merging into the weeds, I'll just step back and say the point being that Trump and his lawyers believed, at least initially, that they could get alternative slates from the legislatures in the individual states, swing states, to forward to Congress alternative slates, and the vice president would then, and Congress would count those electoral votes rather than the electoral votes that were cast for President Biden. And then eventually, when they were turned away on that effort, they tried to get, frankly, just illegitimate electoral slates sent to Congress, by which I mean not lawfully certified by the states as being the electoral slates. And of course, they were eventually unable even to do that. And that's what led to the most far-fetched of the legal team's view that even so, the vice president could reject legitimate electoral slates that had been forwarded by the states, and at the very least, send it all back to the states, for new slates, delaying the electoral count on January 6th.
And are you friendly to proposals that to try to also deal with the, let's call it, quote, legitimate efforts or more legitimate efforts by state legislatures to, in this case, suddenly after the election, overturn their own state laws, change their own state laws, and recognize whoever they wish to recognize, even if they did that in a, so to speak, lawful way with votes of the actual Pennsylvania state legislature in accord with their own rules and so forth? Do you think that should be, has to be sort of, that can't be quite foreclosed as a possibility, or could you that at least have a court judgment about whether this was legitimate or not? Or, I mean, are we still in a sort of Wild West situation if the independent state legislature doctrine takes hold?
I'm going to avail myself of the elegance of your question and answer in this way. No, Bill, I'm not friendly to that tack. Either as a political matter or as a constitutional matter.
That tack being the bringing in the judges, in effect.
No,
the opposite.
The tack I'm talking about now is the tack you referenced, which was to get alternative slates from the state legislatures.
Right. Oh, thank you. Okay, good. No, that's what I thought, but I wasn't sure. Yeah, the ambiguity of my own question was haunting that. But yeah, I just think, I mean, leaving aside what could or couldn't be parsed from constitutional law, I suppose, I mean, politically, I think it would cause incredible disarray and disruption and put everything up for grabs in every swing state for weeks after the vote. And I mean, it's just something we've managed to avoid in this country pretty well, actually, for quite a long time.
The country would be on tender hooks for the rest of history.
Yeah.
At the point of every quadrennial election.
It's funny, until you go through something like we all went through a year ago, you don't almost realize how big a gift it is to live in a country where, whatever our slightly quirky way of counting and the electoral college, and some places come in later than that, we count some ballots, after others, depending on if they were cast early. Still, at the end of the day, we kind of look at the results and it's up there on the screen, and we know how the electoral college works, and Pennsylvania's votes go this way and Arizona's go that way, and it's resolved. And not having an election resolved clearly, when it has been resolved clearly, it's Bush v. Gore would be a different situation, I think. But when it's been resolved clearly by the rules under which the election was conducted, that's a very dangerous situation for a country, don't you think?
Oh, there's no question. I was about to say that our system is famously complex, but actually as a result of some of the most recent presidential elections, we're able to see that it is the system actually allows us to determine the presidency to near perfection. And I'm only speaking now not about any possible kind of fraudulent voting. I'm just talking about the system, and I'm specifically referring to, Bush versus Gore, So the system is capable of determining the presidency down to the individual vote, is the point I'm trying to make, which is, frankly, to use your phrase, that's an astonishing accomplishment of the system that was designed hundreds of years ago.
So as we look ahead to 2024, I guess there are several causes for alarm. Maybe you could just speak about each. There's the possible failure to fix what could be fixed in terms of the Electoral Count Act. There are legal doctrines out there and political doctrines out there that might encourage a kind of misbehavior, let's call it, or trying to jimmy the system after the fact, which has been very much discouraged in the US for a long time. And third, there's the actual, the fact that major parts of at least one party don't accept 2020 as a prelude to presumably not accepting the clear results, if they are clear, on election night of 2024. So how alarmed should we be about each of those? I guess the legal situation, the current state of law or the failure to fix the law, the doctrines, political and legal, that are floating around, and then third, the kind of broader political sentiment out there. You've discussed that last one a bit, of course, already.
The 5-alarm fire alarm has been going off continuously since January 6th. And that's on all of the aspects that you've mentioned. That's why I am very concerned about where the country is today. In my view, we haven't even begun to address the problems. And as I said, as of this moment, I believe there's a complete unwillingness to address the problems. That's why I believe, as to the larger problem that you referenced, which I've described as well, I've said publicly that America is at war, but it's not a war against a foreign power. We are at war with each other, and that is a war that's one war that America cannot win, and that's the umbrella observation that I would make in response to your last question about where are we on the larger political issue. Well, no, I'm not going to call them political. The larger fundamental issues about America and our democracy that must be addressed in the first instance before there's any hope of addressing the sub issues of legislative changes and voting changes.
One point I've tried to make, I think rather ineffectually, when talking to members of Congress and those talking to members of Congress about the Electoral Count Act reforms, is they can quickly become a quite complicated discussion, of course, as you know much better than I, and both in terms of how many senators should be required to raise an objection, and also how does the 3-judge court that might look at an attempt in conflict in states about who the legitimate electors are. How does that work? And I have no view on any of that, but I always try to say, sort of in the role that maybe you're suggesting here, look, it's really important to show that we can come to some agreement on at least partial fixes. If they're not 100%, maybe they're 80% or 90%, they're in good faith, at least they're directionally in the right direction. And that itself will be good for our political culture. So reversing what you say, that, I mean, it's true that you can't really have much in the way of legislative achievements probably without a change in the broader understanding and attitude, but maybe a modest legislative change could help nudge some people into a more constructive attitude. But having said that, it's not, we haven't had those changes. So I think you're right, and I'm just whistling past the graveyard at this point. It seems like
you're a practical political leader of high order. I'm not a leader of anything, and I'm certainly not a political leader of anything. But as I've said and written, the ultimate disillusionment of all of this is that, in my view, not one single national leader of ours with the moral authority, the conviction, and the courage and the willingness has spoken out and called a halt, a stop to all of this nonsense. In my view, not one single person. Now, you're already with that mind of yours going, well, this person spoke out, and just I cabin my thought with the words, not a leader with the moral authority first, that is to speak to the country and have the country listen. That carves out some of the names that I know that you were already thinking, and then the willingness and the courage, and it's for me, when I add all of those conditions, not one single leader in America has spoken out, frankly, for the past 6 years.
Oh, that's a strong statement, but I think maybe a fair one. And it is kind of striking again as to my people coming down from bars. I mean, you'd think, well, gee, we have former presidents of both parties. We have former people like yourself, very respected judges who were appointed by presidents of both parties. You have spoken out now, but how many of them have gotten together and said, look, we would differ on who we support in 2024, perhaps, if it's, I don't know, I'm making this up, obviously President Obama and President Bush, but we can't have this go through this again, and we need to do what we can to fix this, both in terms of legal changes, but also asking candidates to vow not to do what, on either side, incidentally. It's not like Democrats won't be tempted if Vice President Harris is presiding in January of 2025 to follow in those footsteps, perhaps, if the conditions are comparable. So, but it is striking how little of an effort there's been to get pledges from candidates, to educate the public, to get members of Congress on board. Of course, one way to get them on board is to pass legislation behind, let's make sure our system doesn't crash after what we went through in 2020, 2021.
Well, I was going to say that I'm way out of my depth in even suggesting it, and so I'll qualify it. And you can tell me if I'm way beyond my skis. But we don't have and haven't had for a long time now in the single person a leader who can speak out and be heard by both sides of the aisle. A Hubert Humphrey type figure, or and you can name 5 others, readily. But to the last point you made, Bill, the one thing I am convinced of, which may not sound to be saying much, is that the first thing that must happen is we must talk to each other. Okay, and I want to say it in just that way. Right now, America is not talking to each other, let alone discussing these things, let alone reasoning through them to a consensus as to how we address this historic moment of utter chaos in America.
Yeah, that's a task for everyone, and one to which you're contributing. But I do think, yeah, to come back to the legislative side, which you've been involved in some, it is a case where, at its best, of course, these conversations happen everywhere in civil society and in the legal sphere and in so many spheres. But one good thing that Congress can do, has in the past at least, is provide an example of coming together in a bipartisan way to do some things that have to be done, people making compromises. And then that does give a little bit of a green light or a yellow light to other people to move in that direction. We have, of course, the opposite dynamic now, where people are screaming, members of Congress are screaming, no one's coming. Yeah, it's a vicious cycle in the snowball, as it were, in the other direction right now.
That, of course, you're right, and that would be a beginning.
Well, let's hope that people watching this conversation, members of Congress and their aides and others who influence them, will be energized to make this beginning, which they've been talking about a little, happen. I do think, I mean, you are not an alarmist by nature. You've said earlier you were ham. I'm not sure about that, but well, I think you have. But you are capable of doing that. But you're also an optimistic person and someone who served the country so well, and a lot to be proud of in your public life and in what's happened in our public life in the years you've been in it. But for you to be this alarmed is not like, someone on Twitter saying, "Oh my God, I'm alarmed," as I've done in the past, or people on the outside who don't have your experience saying, "Well, it looks bad to me." You have thought about this a lot and lived through this, and I think it's very important that people take your alarm seriously. It's not lightly offered, I believe.
It's not lightly offered. I am alarmed, but I am hopeful.
That's a good note to end on, and we'll have to get back together and see maybe a year from now, honestly, about whether things have moved in a hopeful direction or even continued down this very unfortunate path. Judge Mike Luttig, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate this. Not always most cheerful discussion, but I think an important one for people to listen to your voice of wisdom and experience here. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it.
And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.